give you a warning. You may have more time than usual,
All right.
although I'm very unpredictable, as you know.
That's, it's all right. I'm adaptable, so we're a good match.
Sometimes I think of things that I didn't really have planned to say, and I say them anyway. So.
I know how it is. I say
Yeah.
things I don't intend to say all the time.
All right. So I do that too, but that's a little different category.
Oh, you're more people.
Okay, so I think we'll start. We're going to call it. Oh yeah, we actually have a quorum. What I call a quorum now. So we'll start. And what we're doing, as everybody already knows, we're looking at different literary genre. We start with the thesis that the Bible is mythology made up of a lot of literary works. They fall into certain genres, some of which are today and some are only for ancient times, but most of them are still around today. So our format has been, we've been talking about the genre first, and then looking at some examples in the Bible to sort of give us some practice in determining how to read a passage by first determining what genre we're reading. And of course, the classic one would be you read a factual narrative account differently than you do a poem. Everybody knows that, but it's odd in a way how people will read the Bible as though everything is just the same. You just go along and read everything in the same way. But that decision has to be made. I mentioned when we first started this about my childhood, what we were taught in Sunday school. Always first you say, who is speaking and to whom are they speaking? And that's just another way of saying what genre is this? We all speak differently depending on who our audience is. So we were talking last time we started with epistles, and we're going to do epistles again today. And so we sort of covered the ground about ancient epistles, but I did have just a cleanup, and this is kind of jumping around here. I hope you won't get too confused by this. I was thinking about this epistolary, is that the right word? Episcatory? Anyway, that form of writing is used in a lot of modern works where it's not actually a letter, but it's written as though it were a letter. And I began to try to think, and I did a little bit of research, and I'm sure you all could add to these, but about famous literary works now that are written as though they were a letter. I don't know if you're familiar with this book called 84 Charing Cross Road. If librarians all know this book. It's a lovely book, and I won't stop and tell the plots of all these books. We'll really get off. But there's Charing Cross Road is a road in London. It was just all bookstores. I love Charing Cross Road. I've spent a big chunk of my life on Charing Cross Road, and I have a lot of books that I bought in the bookstores in Charing Cross Road. Anyway, this book was written. A woman begins to write letters to order books from America to a bookstore at 84 Charing Cross Road. And she corresponds with this man who's one of the book dealers there all of his life. And then she begins to realize she's not getting letters back. And so she decides to go to London to find it, and he has passed away. And so the book or novel or whatever you want to call it is the letters between these two people who never in either of their lives ever meet each other, but who develop this wonderful relationship based on their love of books and so on. That's 84 Charing Cross Road. Did you know Dracula and Frankenstein are both written in a sense as though they're letters, actually more that they're like a diary or a journal. And that's a whole form of literature too. And there's some very famous works that are written as though they are someone's diary, or maybe they actually were. Of course, Anne Frank, we always think about as a classic example of that. But both of those sort of horror things do the same thing. They're written as though they're a diary or correspondence. And you know, the novel, we know the movie, The Color Purple, but the novel begins, "Dear God." And it's written as though it is a letter to God. Then there are the famous letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. After they were both retired, they hated each other as politicians. But as old men, they began to write letters back and forth. And I'm fascinated by the way people wrote letters in the 18th century and early 19th century, because you think these guys had to know someone else was going to read this letter someday, because it's written with such beautiful literary flourish and so on. And surely when John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, he'd just say, "Dear Tom," and then just say something. He just thought Tom would be the only one who ever read that. And that's getting me to my point that quite often a letter may be written specifically to someone, but it's really written for a much larger audience. I want to mention one of them, probably maybe more you familiar with this one than any of the others I've mentioned. A very famous theological book is written as though it's letters from one, I can't say exactly one person to another, one entity to another. You know what I'm talking about? The screw tape letters, right? It's got, you got the sort of the old man, the mentor demon and the beginner demon. And the letters written back and forth to them. So what I'm trying to say to you is we sort of emphasized last time a letter that's a real letter where you're going to write to your Aunt Martha and tell her what's going on, and you write it that way. But sometimes people write letters in which even though they are doing that, they know they also have in their mind, I want lots of people to read this letter. There's one example where Paul just says, I want you to read this letter, then I want you to send it over to Laodicea and let them read, and then I want them to send the letter I sent to them and back to you. So, and that genre is a little different from the personal letter. Sometimes they call those a circular letter. The Pope regularly sends out these, what do they call them? Anyway, it's a document that's written like a letter to the faithful. And it's meant for everybody to read it. Well, with that background, I just want to briefly say, and then I'm going to quit. It's interesting to look at the New Testament. After all, I think, isn't it 21 out of the 27 books or works in the New Testament are letters? I mean, this is the major genre of the whole New Testament. But they're not all letters like, dear so-and-so, da-da-da-da, love so-and-so. They're not letters put in that way, even though in some cases they may follow the form, but they are meant to be read by a lot of people. I think that Fallon's going to talk about this, so I won't say too much about it. The Epistle to the Hebrews. We call it the Epistle to the Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. But when you start reading it, it does not start out, dear Hebrews, or from so-and-so to the Hebrews, like, say, most of Paul's letters do. It just starts out, God, who at various times in sundry ways in the past spoke through the prophets. It just starts out, And yet, at the end of that, there's a whole lot of personal notes. I want so-and-so to say hello to so-and-so, And so scholars have argued for years about whether to call Hebrews a letter or not. It's obviously at some point it was sent to somebody as though it was a letter, but it doesn't have all the qualities. James is the same way. James, however, does start by saying to the 12 tribes, which is very interesting. And what I want to do is this is an interesting thing. You might want to do it sometime. Just go through your New Testament and get these 21 books and see the ones that are in letter form. To whom are they written? From whom? Who's the author? And then to whom are they written? Because it will often be a large group. In fact, sometimes a sort of nebulous group. And that gives you the clue to say, now this is written in the form of an epistle, but it's obviously meant to be read by lots of people, just as I'm sure that C.S. Lewis knew that somebody besides these two demons were going to read these letters. So I just got to say this again. I've said it before, probably in this class, but forgive me. I actually had a teacher in graduate school who was a good friend of C.S. Lewis. So we're talking about degrees of separation. I always loved that I actually knew somebody who used to sit and smoke cigars with C.S. Lewis. And that was a wonderful opportunity. But anyway, The little letter of Jude, it's addressed to those who have been called. Which in a sense, I mean, it's broad enough to simply mean I'm writing to my Christian brothers and sisters, to those who have been called. Because the word ecclesia means the called out ones. So it's another way of saying I'm writing to the church, but not to a church like Paul often writes to the church in Corinth or whatever, but just generally to those who have been called. That's why, by the way, some of these little letters toward the end of the New Testament are called the general epistles. They don't call them that because they're just deal with general topics or something. It means that they were written, not just written to a specific person or a specific group. They are written to the general, maybe not the general public, but to the general Christian public. Peter, I don't remember if it's First Peter or Second Peter, begins by saying, Peter, to God's elect. First Peter, okay. God's elect. And then, interestingly, he does narrow that a little bit, just a little bit. He says, I'm writing to God's elect who are exiles in, and then he gives a list. And if you'll get a map, a first century Roman Empire map, and look at it, these are all provinces of one modern country. Does anybody know what it is? It's not even a Christian country now. Turkey. First Peter is really written, oddly enough, to Turkey, to the provinces of Turkey. But he says to God's elect who are exiles in these places. That's interesting too, because they weren't exiles in the sense that they were somewhere else and got exiled to be there. They were exiles because any Christian, wherever they live, is an exile. I think I got on the stump once before in this class already about that. I'm not sure we talk enough about that nowadays. In the days when we argue about Christian nationalism and is America God's chosen country and so on, it's very interesting to watch the way the New Testament writers treat the places they're from. They're from there and they're proud of being from there and they're loyal citizens and subjects there, but they are exiles there. This is not really my home. When I went to my grandparents' church, the Shaddy Church down in Wright County, Missouri, we used to sing, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." And that's good theology. And that's the way Peter starts his letter from Peter to God's elect who are exiles wherever they're living. And then I just want to mention briefly these two little letters of 2nd John and 3rd John that we almost never read. They're real short. One of them doesn't even take up a whole page. They're sure enough letters, but they raise a lot of interesting questions. 2nd John they're both actually from someone who just calls himself the elder. Somewhere along the line, we decided that it's John. But in any case, he calls himself the elder. I don't know if he means the elder in the sense of an office in the church or whether he means it in the sense of the ancient sense of communities always had elders. Villages had elders, neighborhoods had elders. It just meant that people have been around for a long time and they have wisdom and so on. And many in tribal communities always have people that they consider to be the elders. So maybe he means it in that sense. It's from the elders. But in second John, he says, this is what's really intriguing. He says, the elder to the lady chosen by God and her children. That's sort of vague enough to raise all kinds of speculation. Is he actually writing to a woman? And by her children, does he mean that that's her biological children? Or is she a kind of, what do you want to say, an eldress? Is she a woman has the same function in the community because tribal communities always have women who function that way. Is that what he's talking about? A lot of scholars think that what he actually means is that he's calling the church itself a woman. You get this in Revelation. We'll talk about apocalyptic literature, but there's this kind of idea that the church is described as feminine. It is, after all, the bride of Christ. And so maybe that's the source of it. Maybe it's a kind of code for saying, to the believers, to the church, whom he describes as the lady. Now, 3 John is written to an actual individual. No fair looking. Could anybody tell me who? This is a name in the Bible. A book in the Bible is written directly to this person. How many of us know his name? Just sprung it on me, so don't worry. It's Gaius, Gaius, to Gaius. No idea who Gaius is, but he's immortalized by having one of the letters of John written directly to him. So that's more of a regular letter written to one person. Well, this will give you a sense somewhat. I guess my point today is there are epistles and there are epistles. There's diversity. And so it's important when you start reading a New Testament book to say, is this a letter? And then it's important to take note of what kind of letter is it? And is this a letter of giving personal advice? Is this a letter giving advice to a church? Is this a letter giving advice to the church in a universal kind of sense? And this helps you to orient yourself for what you read next, which we're going to do now.
Do you happen to know, John? Go ahead if you, I just have a quick question. Do you happen to know why 3 John isn't named Gaius? Because all of the other pastoral epistles are named for who they're written to.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I
was just curious if you happen to stumble across that.
Maybe we should, I don't think the names are inspired of God or anything, the names of the New Testament books.
We should just
Maybe we
petition
ought to
them.
start a movement, call it there's 1 John, 2 John, and Gaius. I don't know, it doesn't ring, but maybe.
I wasn't planning on sharing this. Speaking of things we don't plan to share, but I recently learned that James actually is from the Hebrew name Yaakov, which in the Hebrew Bible is translated to Jacob, not James. So we're going to be talking a little bit about James, but I don't know where that tradition came from of calling it James instead of Jacob when the Hebrew is Jacob. Do you know?
Well, there's Yaakov Hebrew, then there's the
Jacobus.
the Greek word, and then there's the English word.
Yeah.
So we're just using the English word.
Yeah, but usually we translate it Jacob. Like in the Hebrew Bible, Yaakov is Jacob.
Yeah. But since the New Testament was written in Greek, it tends, it even calls Jesus apostle, James. And James, the church in Jerusalem, are all called James in the Bible because it's written in Greek. But I am sure that they weren't. If you called James and wanted to go out for coffee, you'd say Yaakov. Yeah.
Or in Greek, Jacobus, which is
But that's just borrowing the Hebrew spelling of the name. But we sometimes do that. The word John, the name John is in almost every language, but it's spelled differently. So maybe Ian and maybe Juan. So it's all John.
That's interesting.
It's all James.
Cool. It's all James. It's all James to me. Awesome. Well, so for those of you who were here last week, let's do a little bit of a brief review since we talked about the epistles last week as well. So the last week we talked about the Pauline epistles, of which there are 7 or 13, depending on how you count them. And so we talked about Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Philemon. And there are a few differences between Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Philemon as Pauline epistles written by the Apostle Paul. Romans, for those of you who are here, was written to
church in a specific city.
Yeah, all of the churches in a specific city, all of the churches in Rome. And 1 Corinthians was written to, thank you, a specific church in a specific city. So the church in Corinth, a specific church in Corinth. And then the letter to Philemon is written to Thank you. Yes, a specific individual in a specific church in a specific city. And so knowing who the Pauline epistles were written to, of course, those aren't, as John just explained to us, those aren't the only three categories, and we're going to explore that a little bit today. But what were some of the things that we said, okay, knowing that an entire epistle is written to all of the churches in a specific city, what were some of the contextual things we were like, oh, this would be helpful to know in order to interpret this letter well? So like for Rome.
Local culture,
Yeah.
local controversies.
Exactly. Local culture, local controversies, maybe even like who the emperor is at the time, who the leaders are, maybe some of the pagan practices. What about if we're honing in on a specific church?
It will be practiced within the church.
Yeah, like what the dynamics are in that particular congregation, maybe what some of the relationships are on top of that, as well as all of the things going on in that city in that time period. And then what about a specific individual? As a reminder.
The relationship between
Yeah,
the recipient.
exactly. The relationship between the author and the recipient. And so all of that is really helpful information and can give us a ton of insight into what a letter is trying to do and what the author's intention was in writing that letter.
It will also be the challenge that the recipient is going through.
Yeah, that's another
Climax.
contextual thing that could be really, really helpful. Yeah, and all of those and there are more that we could add to the list. It's definitely not an exhaustive list at all, but it's really helpful to have some context, to know who the author is, who the audience is, in order to have some context to best understand what that letter is trying to do. And because it is probably likely that these letters were written with the understanding that at least other people in the area would probably pass it around and read it. They may not have known that it would be preserved for 2,000 years, but they at least probably had the assumption that that letter was precious enough that it would be passed around to other Christians, other Jesus followers in the area, so that other people would be reading their mail, so they would know that. But it's helpful to know what some of those contextual questions are in order to understand it best. And it's really helpful because a lot of epistles have that spelled out at the very beginning. Like if you flip through your Bible and just look at the very first verse or two of each first chapter of each epistle in the New Testament, you would get a good idea of like, okay, these are some things I need to understand. But what if that information is not there? Or that information is obscured? So we're gonna explore that a little bit and add on some layers of what some context might be helpful in order to best understand some of these what we are calling the weird epistles.
I got a question.
A technical academic category. Just kidding.
I got a question before you can.
Yeah, sure.
So should we also look at Jeremiah as a letter and also prophecy?
So yeah, that's a good question.
Jeremiah was very motivating too. I mean, he was giving a climatic encouragement to the children of Israel.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question.
Exactly.
Prophets are, I can see the connection, and it might be helpful to have some categorization of like, okay, the scrolls of the prophets were written for God's people, or maybe even a specific sect or area of God's people at a specific time period, but it is a separate genre. It's not the same as like the New Testament epistles. And part of the reason for that is the way genres change over time, right? It's not the same genre categorization in the Old Testament several hundred years, if not longer, before the ancient first century Roman Empire. And then like we're kind of in a different one. So it could be really helpful. I think all of the Bible, we should really be thinking about original authorship, original audience. Always. We should always be thinking about original authorship, original audience. And sometimes that takes a little bit of effort to like go find, as opposed to like it's not always spelled out because they're not all epistles. So definitely we want to take that into consideration with all genres. Original authorship, original audience, original intent, original genre. and how that genre was used in the ancient culture. And then, of course, that leads us to other questions of what's going on in that time period. What kinds of trials are they facing? What do they believe about God at that time? Because God's people's understanding of God has changed over time, and that can be really helpful. So good question. But prophets are a little bit of a different, for sure, a different category than epistles, but it can be really helpful to know who the original audience was, or audience is in some cases, especially with the prophets. All right, so we're going to take a look at James. James is less weird than Hebrews, but still weird. And I don't mean weird in a derogatory way. I mean weird in an endearing way. I hope you hear that. All right, so James, this is James, the half brother of Jesus, is the author of the book of James. And James, even though we don't know, like we see in the salutation there in James 1, if you're in James 1. I didn't do a handout today. I wasn't expecting this many people here. So sorry. So James 1. So in the salutation, James says, this is from James, and it says to the 12 tribes of the diaspora, or the dispersion, which we'll explore that a little bit. Of course, a letter can't be, you can't address something to like now we can't say, if you put something in the mail and it says to all Christians, like the post office is going to be like, nah, don't have a place to deliver that. Not helpful. It's going to be returned to sender, right? So we need to know, like, okay, what's going on here? Clearly, James is obscuring who the like completely original audience was, who the letter was originally sent to. And James is also indicating this was always meant to be read by more people, right? That was James' intention from the very beginning. We see that in the salutation. So we have to do a little bit of digging to understand that question of original author, original audience. So James, we know, half brother of Jesus, he is also the primary leader of the Jerusalem church. So whereas Paul was the missionary to the Gentiles, that was Paul's, like, even though Paul was fully Jewish, he has a Pharisaic background, he knows the Hebrew scriptures, he's very well versed, he's Jewish through and through. He's also a Roman citizen. His calling is to the Gentile Christians across the Roman Empire. James is different. James has stayed in Jerusalem. James is primarily ministering to, encouraging, and leading the Jewish Christians, or what we call now the Messianic Jews in Jerusalem, the Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And so in this time period, when James is written, when James' letter is written, there's been famine in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of just poverty widespread, a lot of political instability, and a lot of fear that comes with that instability. And specifically also the Jews in Jerusalem are also facing a lot of persecution because they believe in Jesus, for reasons that we probably have understood from other genre classes if you've been here. Believing in Jesus as the Messiah was considered threatening within the Jewish sect. And at this point, Christianity is still essentially a sect within Judaism. It hasn't fully been separated as like a whole other religion at this point yet. So we need to be familiar with that. So the 12 tribes of the diaspora, what could that possibly mean? What are some ideas for what the 12 tribes of the diaspora could mean?
Do with the exile.
Yeah, so diaspora is another word for is used for exile, like where people who have been exiled or where people have been sent off or removed from their homeland, like where they've been. So it's people all over is maybe one way of understanding diaspora. What are some other ideas for what 12 tribes could mean? 12 tribes of the diaspora.
12 being like the nation of Israel.
Yeah. 12 tribes. It's a hearkening back to the 12 tribes of Israel, that were descended from Jacob's 12 sons, right? And so James is using some metaphorical language here, because of course Christians weren't separated into 12 tribes. We know that. They never were. And so James is using metaphorical language here to talk to essentially all the Messianic Jews in Jerusalem and possibly elsewhere as well. the 12 tribes. So it's probably not exclusively because, at this point there aren't, the leaders of the Jesus movement, the way, are trying really hard to unify the Gentile and Jewish Christians. And James is using a very Jewish metaphor here, the 12 tribes of the diaspora. And of course, that's his primary ministry group is Jewish Christians. So he's essentially writing this letter. We don't know who the actual original people were who actually opened the letter, but we know that James intended for this to be wisdom passed on to all of the Christians. There are a few differences from Paul that James does with this letter, and it's not just in the salutation that there isn't a clear recipient of this letter. It is like the entire structure of it. So Paul makes really, really complex and really sophisticated arguments throughout his letters, and they very much read all together. It's hard to take a single set of verses completely out of context and understand it well without the whole entirety of the letter as a coherent whole. James is a little different. James' style of writing is not as a letter making one specific argument for one specific community of people. It's written more like the Proverbs. It's like chunks of wisdom. There are actually 12 of them in these 12 chunks of wisdom in chapters 2 through 5 of James. These chunks of wisdom that are essentially like standalone chunks of here's some wisdom on this specific issue. And they always end with a little pithy, memorable one-liner that is really memorable. What's the most famous one from James? Anyone remember? That's not the one I was thinking of, but that is one too. Yeah. Faith without works is dead. Yes. Pithy one, memorable one-liner. And of course it comes in context of a specific chunk of wisdom, and it's kind of the conclusion of that. But it is, it's something that we can remember. It's this one line. It's similar to Proverbs, right? Proverbs has that too, because it's a lot of standalone stuff. It's almost like vignettes. So instead of making a theological argument in order to compel someone or convince someone to do something or believe something or whatever, James is here's all of my wisdom that I've collected. And even though it's in the style reminiscent of Proverbs, which clearly James would have been really familiar with, it has a lot of callbacks to a lot of Jesus's teachings. Especially do not worry. So the Sermon on the Mount, those kinds of teachings. There's a lot of reminiscence of the teachings of Jesus. And so James is essentially drawing on all of this wisdom from his roots, his Jewish roots, the ancient Hebrew scriptures, but then also his relationship with Jesus and his time spent with Jesus. And he's here's some of the most important wisdom I can collect. And it's a collection of his most practical wisdom. Let's see if there are any notes here I haven't been able to mention. All right, so let's look at chapter 1 for a minute. Let's scroll up here. Let's see which chunks we should be. Let's start with verses 2 through 8. I can go ahead and read it. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face various trials, consider it all joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance complete its work, so that you may be complete and whole, lacking in nothing. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you. But ask in faith, never doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. There's a theme in here in these chunks of verses that I want to draw up for you. Complete its work. You may be complete and whole, lacking in nothing, lacking in wisdom, gives to all, never doubting, like a wave double-minded, unstable, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. So there's something cloaked here in English that is apparent in the Greek, and it shows up throughout this first chapter in James, and it is the unifying theme of these vignette-like 12 teachings that appear throughout chapters 2 through 5. It's really hard to see because we don't speak Greek and this is English. But what of those, I know I just like kind of threw out a few random lines. Do you see a connection between any of those?
An absolutism.
Absolutism, yeah, you're getting close. It's almost there. It's perfection. But here's the problem with the word perfection in English. Perfection, when we think of perfection, we think of what? What are some assumptions we make about perfection? Spotless, flawless, no errors. And it's not a completely wrong translation of the idea in the Greek. But it's not quite like there either. The better translation is wholeness. It's the same word that shows up when Jesus in the Gospels says, "Be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect." The translation is not "be flawless as my heavenly Father is flawless." It is "be whole." W-H-O-L-E. Be whole like my heavenly Father is whole. And one of the things that shows up throughout James 1 is this idea of wholeness. James was really concerned with the fractured mind. A mind and heart that are separated from themselves, living two-faced, living double-hearted, having devotions that contradict each other. We all do this. We're all compromised in some way. It's just the reality of what it means to be human. It's part of our brokenness. It's like a literal fragmentation. And what James is calling us to, and what the healing of God does, is restore that image into wholeness. So I'm going to jump to Genesis 1. This is just to help flesh out the metaphor. This does not show up in James. So Genesis 1, what do we call the sin that happens in Genesis 3? Usually, colloquially, we call it the fall. That word never shows up in the Bible. It's completely absent from the Bible. Nowhere does it talk about that as a fall. It's a metaphor that we've put on the text in order to help us understand it. And I think it's a really bad metaphor, or I think it's like a very incomplete metaphor. The metaphor that's been more compelling for me, this comes from a theologian named Scott McKnight, is a crack. That it's not that we were made in the image of God and then we fell down and we have to convince God to come back to us. It's that we are made in the perfect image of God, and it's like a rock has been thrown at the mirror. And you can still see your reflection, but it's fragmented. It's broken. Maybe there are even a few chunks missing. But like it's still there. We're still made in the image of God. And Jesus's work is healing the image. So the crack, I think, is personally a better way and again, both metaphors, neither of those show up. But what helps me, especially with this idea of wholeness that comes up actually quite often in the New Testament, it's cloaked again, because sometimes our English translations like translate it in different ways to make it more colloquial, which is totally fine. But this idea of wholeness, which shows up a lot in the New Testament, both in the teachings of Jesus and in some of the epistles, is this image of like making us whole again, healing, restoring the image of God in us, which is still there, but like needs to be put back together again. And so that is one of the themes that shows up in James that ties together the other 12 teachings that show up in chapters 2 through 5 is wholeness, singular devotion to God. And James' wisdom that's so practical is this idea of all of our energies, all of our attentions, from the words we say to how we spend our money, all of it should be singularly focused on our devotion to Jesus. It should both come from our devotion to Jesus and be a reflection of our devotion to Jesus. And the reality is, most of us don't live that way. The reality is our devotions are compromised. And our hearts are torn in not just two, but sometimes multiple directions. The reality is, for most of us, for all of us, there are choices we make that are not Christ-like because of other devotions that we have. And James is encouraging us to be continually transformed into the likeness of Christ through and become whole again. Okay, I wasn't planning on talking that long about James. Any thoughts or reflections about James?
I was just thinking of reading this through the lens of today, and my version that I'm looking at is the Common English version.
Yeah.
It's really kind of harsh. I love James, and I've kind of forgotten how harsh it sounds. And I'm thinking of my kids' generation, and there have been books written about all the different generations, and one that I've heard about lately that talks about Gen Z as not being very resilient, and they're staying in an adolescent phase for a lot longer as a result. And I just think some of this is, talking, it says there's just a lot of resilience he's expecting from us. And
Definitely.
I hear that differently than I wonder how my kids hear that. I'm not saying, and I know that that's a stereotype. I know that there are plenty of resilient kids in that generation. However, I think it's an increasing challenge.
Yeah. Fun fact, Martin Luther wanted to take James out of the New Testament. He hated James. So he was like, we should get rid of it. Because, that's when we took out some of the texts of the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, what we know as the Apocrypha, which is still in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. But Martin Luther also wanted to take out James, and mostly because he thought it focused too much on works, and he was all about sola fide. Justification by faith alone. And so, he hated James. Also Luther, had other issues, but that's a good observation. And one of the reasons why we chose James and Hebrews for this is because even though James and Hebrews are dramatically different in style, in tech, in content, they have a similarity. I'm sure they have other similarities too. But one really prominent similarity is that both of them are really trying to seek us to compel us to be uncomfortable. Both of them are very, very, very directly trying to provoke discomfort in us, in their original audience and in us. But not afraid, not anxious, but definitely uncomfortable. Definitely wanting to call us deeper. And that's always gonna provoke a little bit of discomfort. Like John mentioned, Hebrews, we don't know the author. We also don't know the original audience. There isn't a salutation in the same way that all of the other letters that we have. It starts with long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many ways, many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. So it's just jumps straight in and gives us the main point of Hebrews from the very beginning. So the first two verses of Hebrews clarify the entire point of the letter, which is to say, look at all of the ways that our story has led up to Jesus, and everything is consummated in Jesus. And Jesus is a better, fuller, more holistic, more complete revelation of who God is and God's character than all of these other things combined. Even though they're valuable too. And the author of Hebrews, they assume that their readership knows a lot about the Hebrew text. It is kind of interesting that it's called Hebrews, and because Hebrew would have been like, I've used this, I think, analogy before. Hebrews was a really archaic word for the Jews at this point. They were called the Jews at this point. Hebrews is like the word that they used when they were exiled from Egypt, before they were Israelites. Well, they were Israelites by that point. But anyway, before they were a nation of Israelites. They were like the Hebrews. So it's kind of like an old name for them. It's like calling Americans the colonists, like the British colonists. It's really archaic. It's we're not that anymore, right? So it's an interesting word. At least that's my understanding of it. If there are other things that would be interesting.
So what I see in James is that I think James is just trying to give the acknowledgement that giving on the psychological part of our Christian life. You know, that we have to be mind focused, we have to engage again, and don't just rely on salvation for salvation alone to do the work. Although we know salvation has already done the work, but we also have to participate within the work of salvation.
Yeah, definitely.
Because Jesus Christ himself also set the model. He didn't just sit to become the Son of God, he worked to become the Son of God.
Yeah, so you're
we must engage, but
Yeah.
because of the poor society that we live in and this category of society, it becomes very difficult to motivate each other on his matter that is relating onto the work of our salvation, you know.
Yeah, so you're
Right.
challenging Luther's assumption that it's like it's justification by works, which I would agree with. I don't think James is advocating for justification by works
No.
by any means. But and also that language is foreign to the Bible. Justification by works or justification by faith, those are theological things that were added later. Those aren't really like biblical. That's Martin Luther being in dialogue with some other things. But yeah, so and that's why I think this wholeness idea, that like the healing of Jesus, the healing of God through the work of the Holy Spirit and through the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus is what makes us whole. So Hebrews, like that's an interesting difference between James and Hebrews, even though they're both trying to make us really uncomfortable. James is like this super practical book. And Hebrews is this really impractical book. That's not true. But it is really high theology. Really, really high theology, deep analysis of some ancient Hebraic texts of the scriptures. And so the way I like to think about this might be an analogy that's a little bit more accessible to us. Especially if like you've been attending classes with John Wilson before, you probably learned this. But so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels, right? Has anyone heard that word? They're similar in each other, and John is kind of this outlier that's like over here. And the synoptic gospels deal more directly with like what is called low Christology. And that doesn't mean lowly or lesser than. It means they are more explicit, they are more focused on the humanity of Jesus. And John is more high Christology, which again does not mean better than and does not mean, more important. It means that it's more focused on the divinity of Jesus. At least that's one way to think about John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All of them deal with both. It is, God, Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. But the way you read, you can kind of read the differences, right? And that's kind of how I think of like the difference between Hebrews and James. It's not that one is more important than the other, just like with the Gospels. It's not that the Synoptics or John are more important than the others. It's that they flesh out an image of who Jesus is. And I think of James and Hebrews in the same way. One of them is really practical. It's a lot easier to read. And the other one is like really high theology. You have to really sit in it to begin to break it down. And that's true for James as well, and for the Synoptics. But that's kind of how I think of that they help flesh each other out. They're not in direct dialogue with each other, but they do both seem to be written to the Messianic Jews of the first century, to make them uncomfortable. But one of them takes this really practical wisdom Proverbs approach, and one of them takes this really high theology, high Christology approach to try and explore and expand who Jesus is and what Jesus means for our lives. So that's what I'll say about that. I have to go down and do the greeting because so I have to be down there by 10. But I would love for you to wrap us up. John, is there anything that you would like to correct or flesh out?
Well, no, just say that, first I'll comment maybe about Martin Luther. Martin Luther's quote is, he said, this is not exactly, Luther said, for me, James is a right strawy epistle. And what he meant by that was there was not any, it's like wheat, it's just the straw. And of course, what Luther didn't like was he didn't like the statement you quoted there, faith without works is dead. And we can't get into all the theological implications of that, but James simply says, as in my mind, the rest of the New Testament says, and Jesus says, faith expresses itself in what you do, and therefore what you do makes some difference. I understand where Luther was and why he might have come down a little differently. But anyway, that's it's an interesting thing because that one statement, faith without works is dead, was very difficult for Luther, who was, by the way, a great genius. I don't question that at all. But as many geniuses are, he was a little single-minded. James didn't have any place in the singularity of his thinking. The other thing I just say about Hebrews is that many people have pointed out that even though it's called Hebrews and it's all about Jews and Jewishness and the Old Testament and so on, that actually the writer is quite familiar with and uses Platonic philosophy.
Yeah, definitely.
He takes the temple and all of the priests and all that in the Old Testament, and he says those are a shadow or an image of the reality. You remember Plato's cave? Did you get that in? All we see are the shadows, and he sort of develops that idea that the way you read it's another teaching about the Old Testament and how to read the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a shadow of the reality. So there was a high priest, but the high priest is Jesus. There was the temple, but here's the real temple, and so on. And he's constantly doing that. So that even though it sounds very Jewish and it's very much based on the Old Testament, it's amazing that it has this Greek philosophical thing. And that's why some people think that Apollos wrote Hebrews, because Apollos is described in the Bible as somebody who knew the Old Testament, but was a Greek, also knew the Greek way of thinking. So it's
Other people theorize it was a woman, and that's why it's anonymous.
Yeah, and that may be true. I don't know that that's why it's anonymous, but it could have been written by a woman. We just don't really know. But anyway, the point is that you still see Christianity struggling with how it relates to Judaism.
Yeah,
this ties to all of our discussion earlier about the Old Testament, how we read the Old Testament today.
Yeah,
that's probably enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Bye, everyone.